Hi there, this is Lee, and you're listening to In the Moment. And I had planned to just read a few of my notes this morning, but I'm going to also talk a little bit about molecules. Not a surprise because I talk about molecules a lot, but we're going to talk about molecules in an interestingly specific way in a minute or two. But first, I'm going to read a couple of notes. I need to have an instinct for work. Where is the life in me? It's better to have an exact attention than it is to have an exact description. Can I find a way to be more self-conscious in the absence of ego? To let each thing be what it is and not do anything with it. This one's a little interesting. Stop hating negative emotion and instead find your sympathy for it. It needs kindness too in order for transformation to take place. There's more sheets of paper here, guys. Blah, blah, blah. I'd say this is pretty accurate. Always sense, then be. Then continue whatever you're doing. To truly take in any part of life at all, deeply, that is, costs us both organic suffering and organic joy. That is, suffering and joy are organs of perception. Feelings are organs of perception that belong to the higher being bodies, and all of this is a circulatory system. And here is a note that I wrote before I knew I was going to talk about nuclear pores this morning. And I'm sure you're wondering what those are, but we'll get to that in a minute. And what it says here, remember, I wrote this note a couple of days ago before I even knew I was going to talk about this. That's kind of weird. Organization. Imagine if every cell in the heart decided that it had its own independent agenda. Well, that might be a problem, might it not? Anyway, I came across this article that was published, I think, in Quanta magazine. I'm going to include a link to the article on the text version of this podcast. And I urge you to read it because it delves deep into many of the questions I've been raising about the nature of our molecular sensation, something that most of us have lost a good connection with. And this particular article is about the nuclear pore, that is to say, a structure on the surface of the nucleus that allows molecules in and out of the nucleus. And in order to do that, of course, the pore itself has to discriminate between what is allowed to enter and what isn't. And there are thousands of these pores on the surface of every cell nucleus. Oh, by the way, don't forget you have trillions of cells in you right now. So there are thousands of trillions of pores on the surfaces of the nuclei of those cells, and they are executing millions of molecular operations a second, each one of them, in order to decide which molecules go in and out of the nucleus. Well, let's talk a little bit about the pore and its structure, because that's what the article is about. What the article explains is that the pore of the cell is, of course, made from proteins, and they surround it. And proteins were, at one time in biology, always presumed to be pretty static entities that were highly ordered and only folded in a few directions. This was called, going back to my notes, organization of proteins. But there's a weird thing about nuclear pores. The proteins that arrange themselves around the nuclear pore have a bunch of other proteins that cooperate with them inside the center of the pore that are completely disordered. They constantly change their shape, their size, and what they're doing in such a way that the biologists that are studying them call them chaotic or disordered. And they can't figure out how it is that a bunch of unruly molecules, a rabble of trillions of molecules in you, are performing such an important ordered function. And what they say in the article is, wow, take a look at this. Disorder is ruling the order in our bodies. Well, of course, they might see it that way, but calling these proteins inside the nuclear pores disordered isn't really accurate, isn't? Because they're very ordered. They actively discriminate and change their shape and size and what they're doing in order to make sure that the correct substances enter and leave the nucleus of the cell. So they're not disordered, they're flexible. And there's a big difference between disorder and flexibility. And what they are doing isn't mechanical. One of the reasons that molecular biologists, taken as a class, and scientists in general, keep mistaking what they see in science is because they think everything is mechanical. And that simply isn't true. These proteins can think. And I've talked about this in other presentations and essays, going into the way that molecules walk up and down the cytoskeleton or inner structural features in the cell and make decisions about which proteins aren't looking good to bring them back to the nucleus and fix them or discard them. Okay, well, this is another example of intelligence in the cell at the molecular level. What you're seeing when you look at these so-called disordered proteins is thought expressed at the level of the molecules in the cell. Thought exists at every level in the universe. It looks different from level to level. And so, of course, when we look at the thoughts of the proteins in nuclear pores, to us, they look like some disorderly mechanical process. And you could easily argue, given the way that most human beings think, that that's a pretty disorderly process too. Take a look at it. Insanity seems to be a disorderly process, yet it is also recognized as a process of thought, just one that doesn't line up well. Aha! And we come back to that peculiar subject that I'm constantly talking about, which is alignment. Our thoughts align themselves with one another in the same way that proteins in the nucleus of cell align themselves with one another. Alignment is a feature that determines healthy function. And it may not seem this way to you, but the thoughts in the pores of your nuclei affect you. Of course they do, because they're determining the way that your whole body functions. They do it in the brain. They do it in your big toe. So thought at the molecular level is a real thing that's taking place now in us, and it affects us. And perhaps even more peculiar, and important is that the thought we have on this level also affects that level. So in order for a thought to complete itself in a whole and healthy and more intelligent and useful way in being, well, there needs to be harmonious thought on both ends. And harmony is a flexible thing. It doesn't follow one rule, it has many. So we need to find a way to align ourselves on every level. And the best way to discover an alignment between the gross conditions of our thought on this level and thought on the molecular level is to come into a deeper relationship with the other level. So we are working for a way to bring sensation into contact with thought of being on this level. And we are working to become open on this level to the being sensation of thought on the microcosmic level. If these two levels form a more harmonious relationship, in the midst of their flexibility, a new order begins to establish itself, and we become open to the alignment of ordered thought on a higher level. All of this by way of making a reference to Gurdjieff's higher intellectual center. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the essay on molecules and this not so brief thought, which I've kind of slapped together this morning. Have a good one. Catch you next time.